Away from that event is Congressman and civil rights icon John Lewis. Lewis calls the president's visit a mockery of the civil rights movement.
Now, Trump's visit to Mississippi comes the day after he campaigned for embattled Alabama Senate candidate Roy Moore. Trump backed the man accused of assaulting a 16-year-old, molesting a 14-year-old, and pursuing other teen girls when he was in his 30s. Trump says that Moore is the candidate that the country needs.
We need somebody in that Senate seat who will vote for our Make America Great Again agenda. So get out and vote for Roy Moore. Do it. Do it.
So the decision to be made Tuesday is difficult for some Alabama Republicans. They say in this race they're a bit conflicted.
There are a lot of undecideds who are just kind of like, I typically vote Republican, but I just don't know what I'm going to do this election cycle.
I will make my first Democrat vote ever.
How do you feel about that?
Mixed.
Well, joining us now is Michael Bullington, a member of the Greater Birmingham Young Republicans. Michael, good morning to you.
Good morning.
All right, so first question here. Greater Birmingham Young Republicans prided itself on being the first Alabama GOP group to revoke its endorsement of Roy Moore and to censure him as well. Is the group, are you, like the RNC, like the president, like many on Capitol Hill, back in behind Roy Moore?
I don't speak for the whole group. I know myself and most of the people that I talk to are not on board. Nothing seems to really change to affect the concerns that we laid out in that resolution, including his history in office. And despite some developments on one of the allegations against him, there are still 8 other serious allegations that have come out against him, and he has yet to be forthright, honest, and open in his defense of against those. And because of that, he just is not qualified at this point to deserve to be the GOP candidate.
We'll talk about those developments in just a moment with Beverly Young Nelson and the inscription there in the yearbook. But you have not endorsed or supported Roy Moore. What's your view on the president now going to Pensacola, to the Alabama border, and saying, vote Roy Moore, the RNC spending money to get him elected to the Senate?
It's disappointing to me. Especially, he never actually unsupported him, but the president expressed concern there initially last month, and the RNC did as well. The Senate leadership did. The president's daughter had very strong words about it, and it's disappointing to see that get backtracked. I still, though, agree with Attorney General Jeff Sessions when he said that he had no reason to doubt the women. And that's the chief law enforcement officer of the United States. So if he says that, then that's got to mean something.
So let me ask you about, as you called it, the development in one of the accusations. Beverly Young Nelson, yesterday in Atlanta with her attorney, Gloria Allred, said that she added notes to the inscription that she says Roy Moore, and there it is, wrote in her yearbook back in 1977. Nelson says that she added DA to remind her of who he was, district attorney, although at the time he was the assistant district attorney, the date, and Old Hickory House, the location where allegedly it was signed and she worked. Considering that was not initially disclosed, what's the significance for you of that disclosure, if any?
Well, unfortunately, because of not being upfront and open about that, just by the basic sin of omission, her entire account, to me, might as well just be discounted. Or, and unfortunately, I hate that if it's true, but because that wasn't open in the beginning, you have to call everything into question now at this point.
Well, we should also highlight that she was separate from the 4 women who initially reported on back on November 9th, I should say, by the Washington Post. Let me read a portion of the November 16th resolution from Greater Birmingham Young Republicans. And And here it is. The Greater Birmingham Young Republicans recognize that not believing consistent, credible stories from multiple victims is how many immoral individuals have risen to power, and that moral and intellectual consistency is necessary to maintain the validity of the Republican Party. That from the group of which you are a member. Do you support President Trump?
I support the president. I support the office of the president. Personally, and again, I do not speak for all young Republicans. I did not vote for him in the election last year. I didn't vote for Hillary Clinton either. I did a write-in because of these same concerns. But he is the president now, and I support the office of the president.
Okay, so then let me ask you the follow-up. Obviously, you've clarified, which it seems like the clear inconsistency that if you support the president, then you also should have questions, or logically would have questions about the more than a dozen allegations against him. But if Roy Moore is elected to the U.S. Senate, will your support of Roy Moore change, as apparently it has for President Trump now that he's in office?
My support for the individual would be separate than my support for the office that they hold.
Okay. So let me ask you about what was discussed early on after these first accusations and allegations were made, that there was discussion in the Senate of immediately moving to expel who would be then Senator Roy Moore. Would you support that, the U.S. Senate working for the first time in more than a century and a half, trying to expel a member over the wisdom of the people of Alabama?
I would support it if it involved a clear and open investigation into the legitimacy of the claims against him, and also into the legitimacy of claims against other senators as well.
All right, Michael Bullington, member of the Greater Birmingham Young Republicans, who still, unlike the RNC, unlike the president, unlike many in the Congress and Senate, still do not support the nominee from the Republican Party for the Senate in Alabama there, Roy Moore. Michael, thanks so much.
Thank you.
All right, many civil rights leaders, including Congressman John Lewis, are planning to boycott the opening of the Mississippi Civil Rights Museum because President Trump is going to be there. The NAACP is also going to hold a separate event to recognize civil rights activists without the president there. CNN's national correspondent Athena Jones explains.
Protests are expected to greet President Trump at the grand opening of Mississippi's Civil Rights Museum. Organizer Talamika Bryce told CNN affiliate WAPT News the Say No to Hate demonstration she's helping lead will include hundreds of people from across the state.
Some of us will kneel, and some of us will turn our backs. We're calling it turn our backs to hate, turn our backs towards the motorcade as it drives by.
And Bryce isn't alone in opposing Governor Phil Bryant's decision to invite the president. NAACP President and CEO Derek Johnson denounced Trump's record on civil rights, saying in a statement, he has created a commission to reinforce voter suppression, refused to denounce white supremacists, and overall has created a racially hostile climate in this nation. U.S. Congressman Benny Thompson, who is from Mississippi, and John Lewis, a civil rights icon, are planning to skip the event in protest, writing, President Trump's attendance and his hurtful policies are an insult to the people portrayed in this civil rights museum. And while some Mississippi Democrats called on the governor to rescind his invitation to Trump, Bryant defended the move.
The President of the United States should be able, and we're very thankful that he is, going to come for this historic occasion.
The White House expressed disappointment with the planned protests and boycotts.
I think that would be honestly very sad. I think this is something that should bring the country together to celebrate the opening of this museum and highlighting civil rights movement and the progress that we've made.
President Trump has been criticized for racial insensitivity. He launched his campaign in June of 2015 by bashing Mexican immigrants.
They're bringing drugs, they're bringing crime, they're rapists.
He questioned a judge's ability to rule fairly in a Trump University lawsuit because he was Mexican-American.
We're building a wall. He's a Mexican.
And he has repeatedly slammed mostly black NFL athletes protesting racial inequality.
When somebody disrespects our flag, to say, get that son of a bitch off the field right now, out, he's fired. He's fired!
Jews will not replace us!
But it was his response to violence in Charlottesville, Virginia last summer that drew the ire of people in both parties when he equated neo-Nazis and white nationalists protesting the removal of a Confederate statue with activists demonstrating against them and the ideas they represent.
We condemn in the strongest possible terms this egregious display of hatred, bigotry, and violence on many sides. On many sides.
He revised those remarks 2 days later.
Racism is evil, and those who cause violence in its name are criminals and thugs, including the KKK, neo-Nazis, white supremacists, and other hate groups that are repugnant to everything we hold dear as Americans.
But then said,
you had some very bad people in that group, but you also had people that were very fine people on both sides.
Today's event is an opportunity to answer some of his critics. Athena Jones, CNN, Jackson, Mississippi.
We'll talk more about that visit a little later this morning. A question: why did Congressman Trent Franks, now former congressman, allegedly offer to pay an aide $5 million?
Vote for Roy Moore. Do it.
It will be Alabama that decides whether they want Roy Moore to be one of the two who are the voice for Alabama in the Senate, and we'll see what happens next week.
Good Saturday morning, everyone. I'm Diane Gallagher, in for Christy Paul.
I'm Victor Blackwell. Good morning to you. Next hour, President Trump will leave for Jackson, Mississippi for the opening of a new civil rights museum there, but he will likely be greeted by many protesters. Now, this is coming after Congressman and civil rights icon John Lewis says he will skip the opening because the president will be there and calls the president's visit a mockery of the civil rights movement.
Now, Trump's visit to Mississippi comes just hours after campaigning for embattled Alabama Senate candidate Roy Moore, who is an accused child molester. But Moore also raised more eyebrows this week after a report surfaced where he appears to praise the era of slavery.
Let's start with CNN White House reporter Caitlin Collins, who was at that rally last night. So we've seen tweets. We've seen suggestions. This now is the strongest endorsement from the president of Roy Moore yet.
Well, it certainly was, Victor. The president came to Florida, just 20 miles from the Alabama state line, in an arena that was filled with Alabama voters, and told voters to get out and vote for Roy Moore on Tuesday, just days ahead of this highly contested Senate election. Now, this comes after the White House said repeatedly that the president would not come to Alabama to campaign for Roy Moore after he had endorsed him, but he certainly did just that last night here in Pensacola.
We can't afford to have a liberal Democrat who is completely controlled by Nancy Pelosi and Chuck Schumer. We can't do it. Can't do it. His name is Jones, and he's their total puppet, and everybody knows it. He will never, ever vote for us. So get out and vote for Roy Moore. Do it. Do it.
Not only did President Trump endorse Roy Moore last night, he also mocked one of the women who have accused Roy Moore of sexually assaulting her when she was just 16 years old. Beverly Nelson has brought forward her yearbook as proof that he sexually assaulted her because she says that Roy Moore signed an inscription in her yearbook. Now, the Moore campaign has cast doubt on that, saying it's a forgery. And because Beverly Nelson said yesterday that, yes, she did add the date and the location underneath his signature, the Moore campaign took that to say that she was lying. President Trump brought that up last night. We know that privately he has doubted these women. And all of this comes as President Trump is headed to Jackson, Mississippi today to tour that opening of the Civil Rights Museum, something many black leaders are now boycotting because the president has been invited. And this also comes as some comments have resurfaced in recent days that Roy Moore made back in September, where he was asked the last time he believed America was truly great. And he brought up a time when slavery still existed and said, despite the fact that slavery existed, at least families were united during that time. Diane?
I'll take it, Caitlin. Thank you so much. Caitlin Collins for us there in Pensacola.
All right, joining me now to discuss CNN White House correspondent Abby Phillip and Washington Examiner White House correspondent Sarah Westbrook. All right, ladies, the president coming out last night, overwhelming support, this most full endorsement of Roy Moore, and also choosing, as Caitlin was saying, to discredit at least one of Moore's accusers publicly. So with that accuser amending her yearbook claim, saying that she did add the date and the location there, and the president highlighting it there, does this make it easier for Moore? Does it empower the GOP base there in Alabama, and therefore does it make it almost impossible for Doug Jones to win? Abby?
Well, it's not clear whether it's impossible for Doug Jones to win, but this is a Republican state. It's important to remember that these are Trump voters, by and large, that it's very difficult for a Democrat to win in Alabama to begin with. But I think the fact that the president believed that it was important to do this, to sort of play almost like a trick, going to the Alabama border, but not actually going in Alabama, endorsing Roy Moore, urging people to vote for him, suggests that the White House believes it's important for them to give Roy Moore a boost toward the end. In the past, the president has expressed some disappointment that maybe he came into some races too late to really give the candidate enough support to push him over the finish line. He doesn't want to make that mistake again. So I think that's what we're seeing here with the White House. They want to be responsible for Roy Moore's victory. And frankly, the president thinks that the vote, Republican in the Senate, is way more important than virtually anything else at this point.
Yeah, Abby, he said that, said basically we need to have a Republican in the Senate, this small margin they have right now. Real quick, Sarah, why not? If the president thinks that he has this influence, and he does over so many of these Republican voters in Alabama, why not just go to Alabama and stump with Roy Moore?
Well, I think the White House wanted to have it both ways. They wanted to be able to say, if Roy Moore does end up losing on Tuesday, that, look, the president never went to Alabama to campaign on behalf of Roy Moore. If he had gone to Alabama, Trump's support in the state would have made the difference. They made the mistake of traveling down to Alabama to campaign on behalf of Senator Luther Strange when his victory in the primary was far from a sure thing. Then when Strange did lose that primary, it reflected poorly on the White House and raised questions about President Trump's clout and his ability to steer his base toward his preferred primary candidate. So now that there's still a chance that Roy Moore could lose on Tuesday, I think the White House just wanted to preserve the option of arguing that it's not President Trump's fault.
All right, I want to sort of move on to what's been going on here in Washington. This week, you've got Democrats John Conyers and Al Franken. You have Republican Trent Franks all announcing their resignations amid sexual misconduct allegations. Roy Moore, though, still hanging on. And it appears the GOP voters support him, at least some of them, and of course the RNC does now. The GOP, a lot of them seem to be using this denial technique. The president himself facing several allegations of sexual misconduct from several women, Roy Moore as well. But those who seem to deny and say I have not, are not seeming to face these repercussions. Can this continue to work in the midterms? Are we really seeing a reckoning in Washington, and is that going to translate? What are the implications here? Abby?
Well, it's unclear how far this is going to go. Clearly, the Democratic Party wants to create a contrast between the Republicans who are going back into that Alabama Senate race supporting Roy Moore and their party, which ousted Al Franken, although they have several other members who are caught up in this as well. The key thing to watch here is going to be women voters and suburban women voters in particular, and how they are going to react to this entire atmosphere that's been engulfing the entire country. It's possible that these women in other parts of the country, maybe not in Alabama, a really red state, but in a purple state like Virginia, like we saw earlier this year, might rebel and say, we want a zero tolerance policy. But again, I think it's just a little too early to tell, and the Alabama race will give us a little bit of a clue about how far this idea goes in some of the redder states in the country, where there will be some competitive races like there are this year.
Sarah, the president's visit to the Civil Rights Museum in Mississippi today is prompting civil rights icon Congressman John Lewis and Congressman Benny Thompson not to attend. Here's what the chairman of the CBC said. This White House is not serious about civil rights. From dismantling the Civil Rights Division in the DOJ to equating peaceful people who protested racism to neo-Nazis and white supremacists, they just don't get it. Why is the president going, Sarah? Is this a learning and teachable moment, or is it just a distraction and a photo op?
Well, I think that the White House was sort of in a lose-lose situation once the invitation had been extended. He could have skipped the event and taken criticism for not taking seriously enough the opening of a monumental civil rights museum, or he could have gone, and it draws attention back to his very fraught history with the issue of race. It's always a tense issue for President Trump because he has made blunders on the subject before, both on the campaign trail and in office. Congressman John Lewis, as you recall, also boycotted the inauguration. There's no love lost between Congressman Lewis and President Trump, so it's not entirely surprising then that Lewis is also skipping this event. But President Trump going can be a good thing in the sense that it'll force news networks to cover the opening of this Civil Rights Museum in Mississippi. I think a lot of folks out there probably wouldn't even know that this museum exists if President Trump wasn't going and forcing this to become a major topic of discussion. So there are some positive aspects for President Trump attending, but of course it does raise the specter of his own very problematic history with race.
Abby, Trump has said that there is a sick system in the country that he is working to course correct. I want you to take a listen real quick to his words.
This is a rigged system. This is a sick system from the inside. And, you know, there's no country like our country, but we have a lot of sickness in some of our institutions, and we're working very hard. We've got a lot of them straightened out, but we really do. We have a rigged system in this country, and we have to change it. Terrible.
All right, so a lot of people taking exception to that. Senator Jeff Flake rebutting, this is not a sick system, Mr. President, nor is it a rigged system. Let's not sow distrust in our democratic institutions. You know, Abby, what exactly is going on here with the GOP? Are we seeing this divide continue? I mean, Jeff Flake continues to vote with the president, so that isn't changing, but he is speaking out more, and we are seeing some who still continue to feel like they can retort when the president says things like this.
Well, you're seeing more and more Republicans like Jeff Flake and others, John McCain, speaking out about moments like this. But you're right, Diane, they don't vote against the president when, push comes to shove. I think ultimately they share a lot of the agenda items, whether it's tax reform or repealing and replacing Obamacare, and they will vote for him by and large on many of these issues. But Jeff Flake himself has said when he feels like he needs to speak out, he's going to do it. At the same time, the question is, what kind of impact is this having? The president's been saying these kinds of things since he was a candidate, and it's only increased as president. He's criticized sharply the FBI. This is something that for the Republican Party is fairly new, and you're still not seeing a kind of groundswell of pushback, especially from leadership, to this idea that the democratic institutions of this country are corrupt, and that only Trump can rectify that issue. I think there's still a reluctance among many Republicans in Washington to do more than just send out a few tweets and say they're disappointed or say that they don't agree. They won't vote against the president when it matters on big issues.
All right, almost a year and still debating on whether words matter or not. Abby Phillip and Sarah Westwood, thank you both.
Let's take you out west now. The wildfires burning out of control in California. Conditions today are threatening to make it worse. CNN's Stephanie Elam is live in Southern California.
Good morning, Victor. Nearly 170,000 acres have burned here just this week in California. I'll have a live...
Welcome back. I'm Diane Gallagher, in for Christy Paul this morning.
I'm Victor Black. Well, good morning to you.
In just a few hours, President Trump will attend the opening of the Mississippi Civil Rights Museum. One of the African-American leaders boycotting that event, a man whose picture is likely on the walls inside the museum, Congressman and civil rights icon John Lewis. He calls the president's visit a mockery of the civil rights movement.
The president's visit to Mississippi comes just a day after he campaigned for embattled Alabama Senate candidate Roy Moore. President Trump backed the man accused of sexually assaulting a 16-year-old, molesting a 14-year-old, and pursuing other teen girls when he was in his 30s, saying that candidate Moore is the candidate the country needs.
We need somebody in that Senate seat who will vote for our Make America Great Again agenda. So get out and vote for Roy Moore. Do it. Do it.
Yeah, many civil rights leaders, including Congressman John Lewis, are planning to boycott the opening of that Mississippi Civil Rights Museum because President Trump is going to be there.
And the NAACP will be holding a separate event to recognize civil rights activists without the president. CNN's national correspondent Athena Jones has those details for us.
Protests are expected to greet President Trump at the grand opening of Mississippi's Civil Rights Museum. Organizer Talamika Bryce told CNN affiliate WAPT News the Say No to Hate demonstration she's helping lead will include hundreds of people from across the state.
Some of us will kneel and some of us will turn our backs. We're calling it turn our backs to hate, turn our backs towards the motorcade as it drives by.
And Bryce isn't alone in opposing Governor Phil Bryant's decision to invite the president. NAACP President and CEO Derek Johnson denounced Trump's record on civil rights, saying in a statement, he has created a commission to reinforce voter suppression, refused to denounce white supremacists, and overall has created a racially hostile climate in this nation. U.S. Congressman Benny Thompson, who is from Mississippi, and John Lewis, a civil rights icon, are planning to skip the event in protest, writing, President Trump's attendance and his hurtful policies are an insult to the people portrayed in this civil rights museum. And while some Mississippi Democrats called on the governor to rescind his invitation to Trump, Bryant defended the move.
The President of the United States should be able, and we're very thankful that he is, going to come for this historic occasion.
The White House expressed disappointment with the planned protests and boycotts.
I think that would be honestly very sad. I think this is something that should bring the country together to celebrate the opening of this museum and highlighting civil rights movement and the progress that we've made.
President Trump has been criticized for racial insensitivity. He launched his campaign in June of 2015 by bashing Mexican immigrants.
They're bringing drugs, they're bringing crime, they're rapists.
He questioned a judge's ability to rule fairly in a Trump University lawsuit because he was Mexican American.
We're building a wall. He's a Mexican.
And he has repeatedly slammed mostly black NFL athletes protesting racial inequality.
When somebody disrespects our flag, to say, get that son of a bitch off the field right now, out, he's fired. He's fired!
Jews will not replace us!
But it was his response to violence in Charlottesville, Virginia last summer that drew the ire of people in both parties when he equated neo-Nazis and white nationalists protesting the removal of a Confederate statue with activists demonstrating against them and the ideas they represent.
We condemn in the strongest possible terms this egregious display of hatred, bigotry, and violence on many sides. On many sides.
He revised those remarks 2 days later.
Racism is evil, and those who cause violence in its name are criminals and thugs, including the KKK, neo-Nazis, white supremacists, and other hate groups that are repugnant to everything we hold dear as Americans.
But then said,
you had some very bad people in that group, but you also had people that were very fine people on both sides.
Today's event is an opportunity to answer some of his critics. Athena Jones, CNN, Jackson, Mississippi.
All right, now let me bring in Errol Lewis, CNN political commentator and political anchor for Spectrum News, and of course several civil rights leaders boycotting the museum opening because of the president, like Athena said. Errol, what do you think about the boycott? Does this let the president control the narrative here?
Well, no, actually, I was kind of hoping all along that the Civil Rights Museum itself would maybe put together a last-minute edition, a little display on the Take a Knee movement, the professional athletes that have been demonstrating, as civil rights demonstrators often do, by sort of disrupting the ordinary flow of things. The president has squared off against them, and what better place to maybe sort of show the spirit of the movement than to recapitulate it right there and then. I don't know that the president gets to control the narrative of this. There's too much history in Mississippi, and the deeds of John Lewis and the other civil rights movement leaders, I think, are etched in our memories and in stone in a way that really can't just be undone in one news cycle.
Do you think this is something the president potentially, even though there are many members now who are not attending, people who are not going to this, president could learn from this, or is this just some sort of photo op here?
No, I mean, look, racial divisiveness has been at the core of the Donald Trump brand. I mean, that was an excellent sort of summary you just had there, but it left out birtherism, which is how Donald Trump sort of built his political career. It left out the Nixon administration back in the 1970s suing Donald Trump and his father for discriminatory policies in how they ran their apartments. It left out the Central Park Five and the race-baiting attack that he sort of drove in the 1980s. This has been going on for decades now with Donald Trump. I think, again, it's going to take a lot more than walking through a museum and looking at some exhibits to turn this around. I mean, for Donald Trump, this is the basis of his power in a lot of ways.
Okay, in saying that, President Trump offering this full-throated endorsement of Roy Moore last night just across the state line in Florida, in Pensacola. I want to play some sound for you from Roy Moore. It was from a couple months ago. It was in response to a question from one of the only African Americans in the audience. He asked Moore when he thought America was last great. Take a listen.
I think it was great at the time when the families were united. Even though we had slavery, they cared for one another. People were strong in the families. Our families were strong. Our country had a direction, and we corrected many of the problems.
So there is a lot to unpack there. In addition to, of course, the accusations of child molestation, Errol, do you think comments like this coming to light now will cost Roy Moore votes?
Well, unfortunately not. I mean, look, what you just heard there is a snippet of kind of a fantasy that many conservatives have told themselves in the Confederate States for a long, long time. That, oh, well, yeah, there was this thing called slavery, but our families were strong. I'm not even sure whose families he's talking about. This is just kind of a fairy tale that people tell themselves, that there was some glorious past, and that the bitter, inhumane institution on which it was built somehow either didn't make a difference, or it kind of went away after a couple of protests in the 1960s. It's hard to say what Roy Moore was getting at, but you know, it's a story that one hears quite often, that there's this notion that America is all about progress, and progress goes from the distant past to the glorious future, and what happens in between and what makes it happen is often skipped over.
All right, Errol, really quick, I want to get some reaction. Doug Jones, Roy Moore's opponent, sent out this flyer of an African-American man, kind of giving the side eye, looking perplexed. And the words, think if a black man went after high school girls, anyone would try to make him a senator. It's not gone over too well. Errol, Mark Lamont Hill earlier in the hour said, like, you know, maybe it's right, but wasn't necessarily the right way to do this. It wasn't the right thing to do. What do you say?
Yeah, you know, when I've been looking at politics for over 30 years, and when people look at a race like the Roy Moore race, and they say, well, the guy's got so many scandals and problems, he's been thrown out twice as Supreme Court judge, he's really behind the eight ball, and I say, never underestimate the ability of politicians, especially in the Democratic...
...to be one of the two who are the voice for Alabama in the Senate, and we'll see what happens next week.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Diane Gallagher, in for Christy Paul.
I'm Victor Blackwell. Good morning to you. Now, in just a few hours, President Trump will head to the opening of the Mississippi Civil Rights Museum. Now, there's resistance from several black leaders. Congressman and civil rights icon John Lewis is leading this charge, calling the president's visit a mockery of the civil rights movement.
Yeah, Trump's visit to Mississippi comes just hours after campaigning for embattled Alabama Senate candidate Roy Moore, an accused child molester. Roy Moore raised more eyebrows this week after reports surfaced where he appears to praise the era of slavery.
Now, both President Trump and Judge Moore attempt to discredit the multiple women who accuse Moore of pursuing them as teenagers. Now, the president even taunted one of the women after she changed part of her story centered around Roy Moore's signature in her high school yearbook.
We want to get right to CNN White House reporter Caitlin Collins, who was at that rally. Caitlin, the president not holding back.
Certainly not. He gave his full-throated endorsement to Roy Moore last night, and that didn't come as a surprise to anyone because we've only seen the president grow louder and more forceful in his endorsement of Roy Moore in the last few days, just days ahead of that very high-stakes election here in Alabama on Tuesday. So last night, though the president was in Florida, there were several Alabama residents in that room. It was just 20 miles away from the state line, and the president waited a little bit before he began talking about the Senate race in Alabama, but he surely brought it up.
We can't afford to have a liberal Democrat who is completely controlled by Nancy Pelosi and Chuck Schumer. We can't do it. Can't do it. His name is Jones, and he's their total puppet, and everybody knows it. He will never, ever vote for us. So get out and vote for Roy Moore. Do it. Do it.
Now, the president also mocked one of the women who have accused Roy Moore of sexually assaulting them. Beverly Nelson says she was just 16 years old when Roy Moore attempted to sexually assault her, groping her, squeezing her neck. And she's one of the people who has brought her yearbook forward as part of the proof of her allegation against Roy Moore. And the president mocked her last night because she said that she wrote the date and the location underneath Roy Moore's signature in her yearbook. Now, all this comes as the president is heading to Jackson, Mississippi today for the opening of the Mississippi Civil Rights Museum, something that, as you mentioned, several black leaders are already boycotting simply because the president is attending. And this comes just hours after he fully endorsed Roy Moore just 20 miles away from his state. And you know that comments have surfaced this week of Roy Moore asking, when he was asked the last time he thought America was truly great, and he brought up a time that he said, even though we had slavery, at least families were still united. So it's likely the president will be asked by reporters about that today when he's at that Civil Rights Museum. Diane and Victor?
Yeah, as he should be. Kaylin Collins, thank you so much.
All right, let's bring in our political panel now. Gabby Morangiello, White House correspondent for the Washington Examiner. Mark Lamont Hill, a professor at Temple University. Andre Bauer, former lieutenant governor of South Carolina. And both Mark and Andre are CNN political commentators. Good morning, everybody.
Good morning.
So we'll talk about the yearbook and we'll talk about the museum in just a moment. But first, Gabby, let me start with you. The last time President Trump waded into Alabama politics, the Alabama voters rejected his candidate, Luther Strange, by almost 10 points. Did the president do the job of rallying the base, getting those Republicans who have been on the fence since these allegations came out about Judge Moore, to get them to the polls on Tuesday?
I think he did what he could. I mean, at this point, it's up for the Alabama voters to decide whether or not they want to send an accused child molester to the U.S. Senate. But he went out there. He offered a full-throated endorsement of Roy Moore after several weeks of kind of wavering. And now we know that, you know, if he does get into the Senate, the president and the White House and this administration are standing behind him. And I think that that puts President Trump in a really precarious position because Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell has promised to pursue an ethics investigation if Roy Moore does become his newest colleague. And whether the White House is going to back that is going to be a big question going forward.
All right, Andre, let me come to you. One of Roy Moore's accusers, Beverly Young Nelson, yesterday alongside her attorney, Gloria Allred, in Atlanta, they revealed that Nelson added some notes to what they say it was Judge Moore's inscription. And they say that Nelson added DA to remind her who he was, although he was assistant district attorney at the time, the date and Old Hickory House, the location where she was working at the time, back in the 70s when she said that Judge Moore signed this yearbook. Judge Moore denies it. What does this revelation mean for you?
I don't know that, Victor, for me, I'm not a voter, but it definitely doesn't make it as credible. You know, a bigger question would be, when did she do it? Did she do it at that time when he signed it where, you know, it would be something, well, you put it in there, she'd always remembered it, or did she go back here recently and add it? I think that's a big question. I don't know if that's been answered already, but I haven't heard that, Victor.
Yeah, and I can't say, and if anybody in the control room remembers specifically if that has been...
to me, that's a big deal. If after she made these allegations, she then went back and wrote it in the yearbook, I think that's a major difference.
That, of course, is a major detail. Let me come to you, Mark. Is this the little bit of doubt that some people who had questions up to this point, who weren't sure, this gives them maybe the clearance to vote for Roy Moore, even considering that Beverly Young Nelson was not one of the initial 4 women who were part of the Washington Post reporting.
Yeah, I mean, oftentimes voters are looking for excuses to do what they already want to do, and in the privacy of the voting booth, you don't really need an excuse. You can just pull the lever. But if someone is arguing that this is somehow exculpatory for Roy Moore, that's an odd conclusion at which to arrive, given the fact that she wasn't one of the 4 original women, and that this particular revelation, if you want to call it that, does very little to change the actual narrative here about Roy Moore. You have to make a decision one way or the other. Having the President of the United States, however, step in could be persuasive to someone, which is why it is sort of not shocking but still disappointing that Donald Trump decided to double down on his efforts to support Roy Moore Jr. Now in the last week or so of the campaign.
Gabby, let me get to something else the president said yesterday about the system, calling it rigged and sick. Here's the president last night in Pensacola, Florida.
This is a rigged system. This is a sick system from the inside. And, you know, there's no country like our country, but we have a lot of sickness in some of our institutions, and we're working very hard. We've got a lot of them straightened out, but we really do. We have a rigged system in this country, and we have to change it. Terrible.
Beyond, Gabby, the rarity of hearing this from a sitting president, 11 months almost on the job now, do we know what sickness he's talking about, where it is, what he's saying is rigged? Who's the they in this equation?
That's a good question. I was watching this live last night and was trying to figure that out myself. I think that he's probably referring to what's been happening with Roy Moore. He still feels burned from what happened with Luther Strange, the incumbent GOP senator whom he endorsed in the primary and who lost ultimately to Roy Moore. And he does feel as though the establishment Republicans and establishment Democrats have kind of waged this all-out war on Roy Moore, and it's very similar to what he went through shortly before last year's presidential election. And so I think that, you know, this claim that this is rigged, that we have a sick system, it sounds very familiar to what we heard just about a year ago last November, and that seems like it's in reference to what's happening with Roy Moore, and I think that's why you see him, you know, out there rallying for him 4 days before the election now.
Andre, I want you to listen to what the president said yesterday when he noticed a black person in the crowd. This is what he said.
I love these guys. Look at these guys. Blacks for Trump. I love you. I love you. By the way, now that you bring it up, black home ownership just hit the highest level it's ever been in the history of our country. Congratulations.
Not true. Third quarter, according to the U.S. Census, 42% here in 2017, more than 49% back in 2004. Andre, does it matter that it's not true to the president? Does it matter to you? Does it matter to his supporters that he just kind of riffed on a lie there?
Well, it matters, Victor, no question. But we all know that depending on who's extrapolating the numbers, depending on where you're getting the numbers from, you can pull a number that you want to make about anything true. And so I don't know what.
No, you can't make anything true.
Surely you can. You could. There would be a different way you could decide home ownership. And so anyway, he may have been given numbers that were vastly different than this, that said, in fact, the amount of people that actually purchase a home since he's been president are up more than any president in the future. In the past, I don't know the exact where he extrapolated that from, so I don't want to criticize the guy for something I don't know about. But I think more that the message he's trying to relay is look, I was told these group of voters weren't going to support me. I went and said I'm going to try to support them anyway. I want to change things in places like Detroit. He got a bigger share than Mitt Romney. I think he's very proud of that. And I think he hasn't given up on trying to produce for them, too, the American dream. I think he truly, in his heart of hearts, wants to help everybody and not say I'm just out there for the Republicans. Now, I know, some people may differ from me on that, but I think he takes pride in the fact that folks that he said wouldn't be for him are coming out and supporting him. And
there's true and there is not true. And saying that black home ownership is the highest that it's been in the history of the country is simply not true. The source that he would go to, because there is one agency that keeps it, would be the U.S. Census. And that's where we got the numbers. Mark, let me come to you. The difference between you can make anything true if you choose.
Right. Yeah, like if you decide that homeownership also includes things that aren't homes, or if we change the definition of owning, or if we mean, by black people, we mean blacks and white people. I mean, yeah, if we change the actual meaning of words, then sure, I guess we can make anything. But at this point, with the president having a long history of misrepresenting data, misrepresenting claims about his own administration's successes, which he has literally done since day one when he talked about how many people were on the mall for his inauguration, whether it was the biggest one in recent history. Because of all of that long history of lies, I would need President Trump to show me where he got it from. I don't share Andre's good faith belief that the president may have made an honest mistake, because there's no evidence that he could have made an honest mistake here. I would need to just see some evidence. Otherwise, I'm going to assume that when he says something that's untrue, it is in fact untrue, that it is not a misrepresentation or misunderstanding, but a flat-out lie. And the thing here that fascinates me about Donald Trump is his constant need to assert that his administration is the greatest in recent memory, that it has done something unprecedented at all times. It's this constant need for a pat on the back based on data that's untrue that really kind of represents a certain kind of bizarre narcissism and a flat-out dishonesty that does nothing to unite the American people.
Mark, let me finish up with you. And this mailer that's coming out from the Doug Jones campaign that he's getting some pushback from as he tries to get some votes or grow his vote in the black community. It's a picture of a black man giving the side eye here with a header. Think if a black man went after high school girls, anyone would try to make him a senator. Is this the most effective way? Is this an effective way to get out black voters? Now, this realistically may be a conversation people have, and people may actually make that face when they're saying it. But is this the way that Doug Jones should be trying to get votes in Alabama?
Yeah, just because he's right doesn't mean it's the right strategy. I mean, he's absolutely correct. But there's a whole bunch of black folk can't do that white folk get to do in America. I think the problem with that is that it doesn't just rally people, Democratic voters, it also rallies the other side who don't like any conversation about race, who are incensed at the very mention of race. So what they might actually do unwittingly is rally the other side and actually double down on the other side's voting intensity. So I think it's a poor strategy. Yeah. But I think people are desperate when you have the President of the United States, joining a child molester. It's very difficult to fight back.
Well, Jones himself has said that potentially they could have chosen different words. Mark Lamont Hill, Andre Bauer, Gabby Margiello, thank you all.
Thanks,
Victor.
All right, President Trump going to be at the opening of the Mississippi Civil Rights Museum this morning, but not expecting a warm welcome. Protests planned, and even some of the people who are being memorialized in that museum are boycotting the event.
Plus, wildfires burn out of control in California. Look at this. And conditions today threaten to make it worse.